Good evening, people. Now, I'm here for number 6 of the videos as part of my challenge for 30 days. My camera seems to be doing some weird stuff with the lighting. So nevertheless, I hope you can hear me at least well enough. But the lighting seems to be fading in and out. What do I know about computers? So what we're going to talk about today is anxiety. And it's a problem that afflicts all of us. You know, anxiety is a very natural emotion. It's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's what has you go to work, pay the bills, has you behave in certain ways, to achieve certain things, to have you be acceptable as part of the group of which you are a part, humanity, your family, your social networks, your career, etc. I mean, it's important to remember that we are, according to science, connected to the monkey gene, and monkeys understood that you needed to survive within a group in order to survive. And there are many things that flow from that. Like if you did something wrong within the group of the monkeys of which your ancestors may have been a part and you were excluded from that group, it meant death, literal death. And remember that we are the descendants of those who did survive. Many did not. So our ancestors had a fairly heightened sense of anxiety. They were the first up the tree when the saber-toothed tiger roamed into the field. They were the first to the back of the cave when the cave bears were roaming around. So our ancestors had a finely tuned sense of anxiety, so we carry it. But we're no longer living in a world that is particularly dangerous, at least not here in the West. And yet those anxiety feelings are real, they're profound, they induce fight or flight responses, which keeps us alive, which keeps us safe. But because we no longer live in a world that is particularly dangerous in that way, then we will transfer that anxiety onto things that aren't actually dangerous. Social situations, needles, lifts, bridges, there is a million of them. And so that which was profoundly useful in keeping us alive back in the day, back in the generations, is now being transferred to something else that isn't particularly dangerous, but we get equally paralyzed by it. So the most profound form of anxiety that underpins it all, from my insights into it, is what we call existential anxiety. The anxiety about being and doing. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But this fight-flight response, and remember we were talking the other day about how things get handed down through the bloodline. So if there was a traumatic event in the life of your ancestors to do with something large and powerful, then that memory is carried down. And so even though there aren't large, powerful, furry things after us necessarily, in our perception, if we see something large and powerful, and there are many things that that can correlate with, then we will have that ingrained DNA response to it. And the interesting thing about genetic memory is that every generation builds on it. So, and it's not often cleared in generation upon succeeding generation. It's added to generation upon generation. And when you consider humans have been around at least for 1 million years, but the modern human for at least a couple of 100,000, Homo sapiens, then we have this accumulated stress built into us. And it explains a lot about why the world is genuinely drowning in a world of fear and grief. We'll talk about grief soon, by the way. So the other interesting thing to know about genetics generally, though, is that each generation takes the accumulated bloodline knowledge of its mother's line and the accumulated knowledge of its father's bloodline and brings all that in at the moment of conception and carries it forward. So each generation is more knowledgeable and better equipped for life generally than the generations that preceded it. And yet we insist upon living in a world where we hold on strictly to fear and control and dominating the young and instructing them in how they will survive and how they will behave. And we bang on about a religious text that's been around for a few thousand years, that's the only rule and cannot be changed, and we have to live with that, despite God knows how many hundreds of generations, thousands of generations that have come since those times. So we live in a world where each generation is better adapted, more able on a genetic sense to confront and deal with life generally. Evolution is a forward-moving process. But we bind each generation with stories and rules that were written thousands of years ago. So it leads to a direct conflict, obviously. And it's not to say there aren't very sensible rules that apply for well-being and safety in each generation. You know, it would be ludicrous to suggest otherwise. It's just that the way we go about it absolutely says to each generation that is better adapted with all the knowledge of its parents to move forward, no, don't trust your own instincts. And rather than us acting as guides for basic stuff, we attempt to dominate and control and oblige them to live by a set of rules that makes no sense and no meaning to anybody, even us, as we're vomiting them forth, okay? So anxiety is a natural state, and that's particularly true, by the way, of the new generations coming in. Gen X, my children's generation, much more awake than ours, mine. Gen Y after that, again, takes it forward. The millennials are an entirely new breed, and yet we're still trying to contain and confine them with rules that were written thousands of years ago. And hi to all you lovely people saying hello. And this particular generation currently, 12 years old and younger, I've never seen anything quite like them. They are an amazing breed of child. They really are the new kids on the block, and they're going to be the leaders and teachers of the future. And yet we're still, and these kids, because they are so different and they've arrived on this planet remembering a great deal more about where they've come from and who they are different to us, so we try and contain them further. We try and make them mold into our world, even though our world is clearly not serving us or anybody else, but we try and bend them to it because that's what unconscious parenting and following the program and the rules is really all about. You know, we know best, we're bigger and older than you. Well, we do know best about some things, but we have no idea what's going on for these precious things that have come in. And this particular generation, 12 years old and under, they genuinely need a lot more time in nature and time alone in nature to discover who they are. When we spend time in nature, alone or with other children, that's when we discover our place in the world. We learn to fall down, pick ourselves up, take risks, fall out of a tree, bounce off a rock and keep going. But instead, we're living in an increasingly contained and controlled world where we live in houses that have no yards. It's wall or eave to eave housing. There are no yards. Children are not allowed to go to the park by themselves and play, never mind climb a mountain and have some fun. So, or climb trees without being reprimanded for how unsafe it is. And so the very thing these children need, we deny them and park them in front of a screen instead, which takes them away from ever discovering who they are. And because we're helicopter parenting them, they don't get a chance to take risks and learn that they can fall down and pick themselves up again. So, as I was saying, the underlying anxiety that underpins all anxiety is what's known as existential anxiety and ontological anxiety. The questions of being and doing and what is it to be a human in the world. We'll come back to that in a minute. So this fight-flight response that we carry genetically, that gets bigger every generation, that we are getting less equipped to manage in each generation with the technology flood that is unfolding in front of us, and all the radiation technology to support that technology and the impact that that has on us. But in the meantime, there are other types of anxiety. So as we live in a world where the mega beasts and the megafauna, fauna, are not out eating us alive, we, as I said, we start transferring it onto things that aren't actually dangerous. So we end up with what's called neurotic anxiety. And neurotic anxiety is an anxiety that is in response to the world that we grew up in, okay? This, and again, as we were saying the other day, trauma produces anxiety, and we become hypervigilant to the reminders of the thing that traumatized us. And so then we develop coping skills to minimize that anxiety. I don't know about you, but having had periods of anxiety in my life for very real reasons, it's an incredibly unpleasant experience. It produces palpitations, it produces sweating, it produces our mind going into freeze or lockdown as we attempt to figure out this fight-flight response. And all those physiological symptoms that we experience, the discomfort, comes from when the body goes into a fight-flight response. The central nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, kicks in. It draws the blood from the extremities, from the arms and hands, from the feet and lower legs, and pumps it into the thighs and the heart, ready to run. It also drains it from the head, which was what produces the dizziness, the confusion, the heart palpitations, because the heart is now pumping that blood more quickly through a more confined area. And so suddenly we're feeling like we're about to have a heart attack, and the demon in our mind will quickly tell us that there's something seriously wrong with us, when it is just a natural response. Now, what happens when we have that experience? It is so painful that what we do is find a way to make it stop as quickly as possible. So if we're having a reaction to a needle or a lift or whatever, then we will avoid it. Avoidance is one of the most common responses to anxiety-producing situations. I'll walk the 35 flights, thank you. I'll drive 58 blocks to avoid the bridge, thank you. I will not go to the doctor in case he wants to give me a needle, when in fact it's possibly sometimes useful to go to the doctor, although I would recommend you go to a Chinese medicine practitioner, an acupuncturist, a naturopath, or somebody else before you enter that path. Unless you've broken a leg, and yes, then we can be grateful we live in a first world country. So it's so uncomfortable, we will do what we can to avoid it. So our sympathetic nervous system that has risen and produced all these effects in the face of the trigger or the perception that we're in danger, we do what we can to avoid it, and it drops immediately. But then we think about it again, and so it goes up and down like this, and the system can maintain that for hours. Whereas one of the greatest cures for anxiety is to simply allow yourself to dwell in it. And after 40 minutes maximum, the sympathetic nervous system is kind of struggling at this point to maintain the status quo, and the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and says, well, for Christ's sake, we're not dying. This is stressful to the body, and I'm switching it off. And so after 40 minutes, it will naturally go down. Now, if you're doing actual education and processes for dealing with anxiety, and you're using a cognitive behavioral approach and an habituation process, you will train yourself over a series of days to go into those anxious situations, remain in them for 40 minutes and let it fall away. And that teaches you and your body that, oh, I was having a lend of myself right there. Now, if you do that over 4 days consecutively, the same trigger, then the first day it might be 40 minutes and you'll be feeling like you're about to have a panic attack. The next day it'll last for 30 minutes or 20 minutes and you think, yeah, well, it's not that bad. The next day it'll last for 5 minutes and you think, oh, well, yes, this will pass. And by the fourth day, it's gone. And the important thing to do when you're going through that self-training is to not reassure yourself. One of the great problems with anxiety of the neurotic kind is that when it happens, we start talking to ourselves in our head saying, it's not that bad, I'll be okay, I'll just avoid this and I'll be all right, kind of thing. But what that does is actually reinforce the neurotic fear. And this is really important for parents of children who experience anxiety. And so when they say, I'm afraid of this or I'm afraid of that, to actually encourage them to dwell in the fear, to say, yep, I can see you're afraid. However, nothing terrible is going to happen. Because when you buy into the fear of a child, let's say a child has serious anxiety and is afraid of washing afraid of touching a pot, or, they need you to put a Band-Aid on everything all the time, or they need you to constantly reassure them that they're going to be okay if they go to school or if they go to that party or whatever's going on. If you agree with them, if you reassure them, if you keep putting the Band-Aid on, you're actually saying to the fear in the child, I agree with you that there's something to be afraid of. And the minute you do that, you reinforce the child's perspective of fear. Or if you say, okay, you don't need to do this today because I can see it's upsetting you, then the fear in the child is saying, see, even the parent agrees with you, it's terrifying. So, yeah, and it keeps reinforcing it. And this is true for adults as well. When you give in to that anxiety and don't go to the party, don't go to the doctor, don't get out of bed, then you're saying to the fear and reinforcing the fear, I agree with you, it's terrifying. And each time you do that, the fear compounds and grows. The only way through this kind of neurotic anxiety is through it. You actually have to face it, breathe it up, just take a couple of breaths. Yep, I'm feeling this fear. It's very uncomfortable. My hands are sweating. My heart is racing. But you don't reassure yourself. You don't tell yourself it's going to be okay. You simply observe the symptoms. And then it passes and nobody died and you go to the party, okay? And the more you can do that, the more you are teaching yourself that the fear is a lie. The fear is a lie. Now, fear of this neurotic kind, by the way, is a response to the world, to traumatic events, as I said. And trauma has such a powerful way of buying into everything about you. Trauma produces digestive issues, somatic issues. It lies and embeds deep in the cell, often at a pre-verbal stage. So traditional therapy doesn't help it particularly. Talking about it doesn't help it because there are no words for what the body is experiencing at the time. And it's really important to recognize this is a perception. This is my body's response to the perception. I'm going to observe the perception and let it pass. And the more you can do that, the more quickly you will navigate through an ongoing neurotic anxiety. So there's the physical symptoms that we've just talked about, but then we develop coping mechanisms to neurotic anxiety as well. And we have a whole bunch of them. There's about 20 generally, but I'll just mention a few. So things like we repress it. We simply pretend it's not there. We distract ourselves. We deal with it with addiction. We drink it down, drug it down. We take prescription medication. We roll a joint, whatever it takes. We have a glass of wine. We suppress it. We pretend it's not there. And that numbs it back into oblivion. Sometimes when we're anxious, we can regress to an earlier stage of being when we felt safe. And this is quite common in children. And you'll see this often when little toddlers, a new baby arrives on the scene, and suddenly your toddler is acting like the baby. It's not doing it consciously because the baby gets more attention, so I'll behave like a baby and get the attention that used to belong to me solely, but now this nasty little bugger has taken it away. It's not doing it for that reason. It's simply taking itself back to a time when it was younger and it got more of your nurturance and support. So when a toddler is regressing, don't be unkind to it. Don't tell it off. Give it the love and support it needs. Include it in the loving of the new baby. Make it a part of the process. Make it helpful. Make it loving. And the child will naturally adapt and move forward. Pardon me. We can sublimate that fear. And often you'll see that in high-functioning athletes, and particularly the parents of high-functioning athletes. A dear friend of mine, Luke, describes who's a tennis coach of renown, and he describes what they call the OIP, the over-involved parent, who is sublimating their anxiety about not being good enough and pushing their child into a stage of excellence in really excellence to make sure that they're a number one tennis star or an Olympian athlete or whatever. Okay, so that's the parent's sublimated anxiety, forcing the child to vicariously live out their unmet needs and fear of failure. And also it can be done in terms of physical sport. You know, we can actually sublimate it healthily into sport or a creative project to move it in a different way. One of the interesting things that come through with childhood consequences of anxiety is that when a child is traumatized, it tends to dissociate. And what that means is the trauma is so big and so painful, they simply step out of the body. They leave the body. Something else comes in and take over. And that is a highly functioning, powerful, adaptive response to the unsurvivable thing that is going on in childhood. The problem is that as you grow, that adaptive response becomes increasingly maladaptive in adulthood. It actually gets in the way of normal, healthy adult functioning. If every time you are confronting an anxious situation, like applying for a new job, going to university, falling in love, whatever, going to a party, you dissociate, you're suddenly not there, then you're not there to adapt, control, and manage your life well. So this can be very problematic. And the extreme end of this, of course, is dissociative identity disorder, where the person develops many or several separate identities that in the face of anxiety will come through and take over. And when that personality aspect subsides, when that part of the psyche subsides, when it perceives the anxiety is over, the egoic structure can come through and think, well, what the hell was that about? They often have no memory of what's happened in those hours or days, etc. So you begin to understand the complications of anxiety and how debilitating it can be. And every time neurotic anxiety is given into, it grows. I swear to God, you make it stronger. I once knew a woman many years ago in Victoria when I was working in psychiatry over there, who, when as a community nurse, we were alerted by her family that she was in serious trouble when we went out to meet her. This poor woman was in the corner of her kitchen with a can of kerosene. Her fingers were all kind of red and raw, and she was scrubbing the floor in front of her, and she scrubbed the whole kitchen and had backed herself into a corner for fear of germs. And this is one of the other debilitating consequences of anxiety and an attempt by the psyche to management, which is about obsessive compulsive things, okay? It can become a full-blown disorder, but we can all be a little obsessive and we can all be a little compulsive because we live in a truly insane world and we've all developed ways of adapting to it and managing it. But OCD in its full-blown form is truly crippling, you know, where someone has to count. Counting is very common. Checking locks, making sure you've turned the iron off 10 times, making sure you've locked the door 10 times, making sure that you haven't run over somebody on the road and you have to back up and have a look several times to keep moving forward. The obsessive thought keeps churning and it produces such a fear response in the fight-flight response that you have to, well, you don't have to, but the instinctive response is to double check. And if you find yourself counting a lot, you know, and we're all familiar with these are all perfectly normal behaviours. It's when they take over your life it becomes a problem. But, you know, if you find yourself counting, you're sitting in a doctor's surgery and you're counting the tiles on the ceiling, or you're counting the tiles on the floor, or things like that. Counting is a way of repressing anxiety, you know. Obsessive thoughts that you've hurt somebody and harmed somebody can really get out of control. Those thoughts, we can get intrusive, violent thoughts that come with this, where suddenly you're sitting there having a lovely meal with your family and this thought pops in that you're going to pick up your knife and stab them all. I'm kidding you not. That's how painful it can become. Or you have this obsessive thought that you've really hurt somebody and you're desperately trying to find ways to make sure that that isn't true. Now, people struggling with obsessive thoughts constantly or can constantly seek reassurance that this hasn't happened. People who hand wash, that's very obsessive and compulsive. And they often need a lot of assurance that the kitchen's been cleaned and the bathtub's been cleaned and what have you. And the natural instinct of the people around them is to reassure them, when in fact it's really important that you don't. You say, yep, I can see you're afraid of this thought. However, I have said it once and I'm not going to say it again. You just have to observe it, breathe it up, and let's go out the door and go to school anyway, or go to work anyway, kind of things. So neurotic anxiety is incredibly complex and very debilitating, and it can become paralyzing. And the only way out is in, through, breathe it up. And also, there are many particular skill sets that go back to the original source of the trauma that flush it out, and suddenly there's immediate relief after one session where you can just go, you see it, you clear it, you feel it, you gain insight from your own psyche, and it's done, okay? So there are many ways of dealing with it that don't require years of, as I said the other day, of intense psychotherapy, which I think just compounds the problem. Habituation exercises from CBT are very, very useful. Mindfulness from Buddhist tradition, which is now being incorporated in cognitive behavioural therapy, also very, very useful. You are mindfully observing the anxiety and letting it go. And we live in a world that's filled with it, let's be honest. Another kind of anxiety is what we call moral anxiety. And this is often associated with authority figures in your childhood, where punishment was extreme, or the thought of punishment was terrifying, or that very person had a wall of energy that walked with them, that the very thought of them walking into the room would go, Jesus wept, what do I do now? And so it produces a battle, I suppose, between the id, the deep part of Freud's ego. Man was a genius. I don't care when he was born and how feminists like to decry him. He introduced us all to the subconscious, and he was a genius. And so the id, which is the part of that says, I see, I want, I will have, goes into conflict with the superego. There are three parts to Freud's ego: id, ego, superego. Id is the primal, I want, I have, I will take. The superego is the voice of our parents, our teachers, our society that says, no, 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 you're not allowed to have that. You have to restrain that. You have to behave yourself. You have to be a good citizen in the world. The ego, the part that's talking to you now, the part of you that's listening, is the part that negotiates between the two, okay? Now, the id is childlike and primal and in some ways exquisitely beautiful, but we live in a society where cooperation is required, so it's not allowed to run rampant and do its thing. The id might say, I want to go out and have sex with whatever's available. The superego says, no, that's not appropriate, that's not proper. So the ego negotiates between the two and says, no, you can't go out and pick people up off the street and have sex, but you can have a video that will satisfy. You can get some porn or something like that, okay? So the superego, the other name for it, of course, is the hold-fast tyrant, which tells you everything you need to know about it. It is a brute. It is an absolute, you will do what I say and you will do it well or you're in trouble. So this, when an authoritative figure in our life traumatizes us or instills us with fear as a natural response, to the id desire, and all babies and children are all id, and it's our job as parents to gently encourage them to understand that they are part of a bigger world, okay? But if we do that in an authoritative or demanding manner, then the superego of the child becomes that holdfast tyrant and a thug, okay? So this leads to feelings of shame and guilt. This leads to fear of social situations because people are going to judge me. It leads to fear of punishment. And so that moral anxiety can be equally crippling in that it prevents us living fully for fear of what people are going to do to us, okay? And so again, it's not useful, it's not healthy, and is worth cleaning out. And the next level of anxiety is the one I mentioned in the beginning, which is the existential or ontological anxiety. Ontological refers to that whole business of being and what are we, who are we? And ontology is about being, and the work of Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, if you can ever get into that and take some time and a year off to read it, you will learn a great deal. And I am eternally grateful to my dear friend Trail for exposing me to all this. I know nothing about it compared to him, but then he's written 2 PhDs on the whole plethora of that, and I just get up here and waffle a little. And existential is the doing in the world, and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Sartre, in terms of ontological and existential anxiety, they insist that we are individuals, completely responsible for ourselves, wholly responsible for ourselves. And as Sartre says, we are condemned to be free, okay? It's real. It's unbearable. I mean, seriously, it's unbearable. Having done an existential journey some years ago that laid me on the couch for a year down at Sellex Beach until I had a lovely conversation with a bookshelf in my lounge room one day, it paralysed me. I literally struggled to get off the couch for a whole year while I went through that. It was very popular in the 70s, but when everyone was waking up and shifting anyway, the late 60s and 70s, it fell out of favour, and I can honestly understand why. It's very, very painful. But basically what it's saying, the existential anxiety or nausea, is, you know, we're on a journey. What is it to be human? Why are we here? What is this about? And the main questions that come up from this are death, dying, being alone in the world, in the universe. What does it all mean? Does it mean anything? And what is freedom? Now, these are hours and hours alone, and they are inescapable. And they are awful. I promise you, they are awful. So awful that we actually retreat from them entirely. And everything in our world, in this current epoch, this current age, right here, 2019, encourages us to retreat from that powerful and important journey that, you know, how old were you the first time you thought to yourself, what's it all about? What is this thing called life? Why am I here? What does it all mean? Okay? Natural, healthy awakening to whatever the hell it is that we're here for. Okay? So we can either retreat from that, oh God, that's all too hard, or we can embrace it fully and go into that journey, that complex, real journey that points to something oh so much deeper in our being. What is it all about? Who are we? What are we? Why are we here? What is this thing called life? Why are we on this planet? What does it all mean? It's real. And as I said, it is truly unbearable. And we will either switch it off, we'll either embrace it, which is the appropriate response, and follow it, and there'll be times when it vacillates. Sometimes it's stronger than others. Sometimes it will put you on the couch for a year. Other times it might have you go and sulk in the corner for a month and not speak to anyone. and you're not sulking, you're contemplating. Or we will transfer it again to things that are not actually dangerous. Our terror of our mortality, that we're going to die one day, and we don't know what it means, and we don't know where we came from, if we came from anywhere. We don't know where we're going, if we're going anywhere. You know, about 98% of humans are convinced that they're going somewhere after life. But very few of that 98% ever contemplate where they were before they came into life. It's quite fascinating, isn't it? And of course, it's the great spin of religion. Religion, which is created to feed off that fear. From stipends in the Dark Age to the current twaddle they waffle now about, save me, Jesus. And it's not just Christianity, although because I grew up in Christianity, I'm more aware of it than others, but all religions bark up the same tree. Be it Confucianism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, there's all an afterlife that if you get it right in this life, you might get there. And the priestly class will ensure that you do if you give them the right amount of money and the right amount of power and blah, 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 which reinforces your anxiety that you are not enough. Paul Tillich, a wonderful German theologian that, again, my beloved friend Trail introduced me to, wrote a wonderful book. He wrote many wonderful books, and his treatises are really good. But one of his books, The Courage to Be, talks about that ontological existential anxiety about our own mortality and how we transfer that onto things of neurotic and moral anxiety to avoid looking at our death. And it's a fascinating thing. It's like the Zen thing, that it's only when we're truly prepared to die in each moment can we actually live in each moment. Only in that moment, heartbeat by heartbeat, where you are acknowledged, I can be dead tomorrow. I can be dead in the next, my heart can give out tomorrow. And if you're not prepared to be aware of that in every moment, then you can't fully live in each moment because you're distracted by the past and distracted by the future. Anything it takes so that you don't have to consider your own mortality. Do you see how it works? And so the object of the exercise is to really be here now, recognizing that you're a mortal being and that you could tip off the mortal coil in a moment. Heart attack, stroke, hit by a bus, plane lands on your house, who knows? But you know, people will spend their whole lives actually not living in order to avoid dying, which is inevitable anyway. And so we waste our lives, tortured by fear, anxiety, and we stop living in order to not die, that we can't avoid anyway. It's kind of bizarre. So I recommend Paul Tillich's stuff to you. I recommend you read Nausea by Sartre. Look, seriously, get into some of the philosophers. Start thinking, start contemplating your reality. It is why you're here. It is why you're here. But we live in a world that constantly distracts us, but at the same time feeds our anxiety. Don't think about death. Don't think about meaning. Don't think about being alone. Don't think about the pointlessness of existence. Here, have this screen, have that screen. And then while you're looking at that screen and that FOMO that comes with it, that fear of missing out, everyone's going to show you the most powerful images that remind you of how wonderful their life is. It's true. I'm on Facebook regularly. I love it because it connects me with all my beautiful relatives that live in various states and friends that I don't contact in any other way. And I want to share the good things with them. But it produces this culture of, and there are now entire masses of people that falsify the screen time beyond their actual reality so that they can seem better on screen than they believe they are in their own life. And particularly for adolescents, while you're putting that in front of them, it's a constant reminder of their own inadequacy. And adolescence is psychosis. It is nature's psychosis. So yeah, let's put them in front of a screen and remind them constantly as they live on that bloody thing how inadequate they are, feeding anxiety all the time, okay? We live in a world that is not about personal responsibility. It is not about personal discovery. It is not about taking the plunge into the abyss of your psyche and discovering what's there. Everything in our society, and it's part of what I describe as toxic patriarchy, is about blame and shame. Look what you're doing to me. Look how inadequate you are. Look at the law you've broken. Look at the government regulation you haven't fulfilled. Bad you, bad you, bad you. And it's fed by your family, your parents who had the same thing done to them. It's fed by your school as soon as you get there. This insanity of making children sit down for 5 hours a day and not move. 4-year-olds sit down for 5 hours a day and listen to somebody prattle on. I know it's improving, but my God, I still believe all schools should be bulldozed. They're appalling dens of taking the vast majority of human potential and funneling it out into a system that is enslavement for the world. Steiner is one of the few exceptions. Finland's got a much better idea about it. And there are places in Russia where students are actually teaching students. And anyway, story for another day. What do children need? So we live in this world where we are constantly taught to not be responsible, to be a victim, to blame others for our misfortunes, blame them, blame the government, blame my neighbour, blame my family, blame this, blame that. It's reinforced all the time by parents, school, particularly religion, the law, the state, because people who are bound in fear and feeling hopeless about their lives, they're so much easier to manage. And they're so more likely to hand over their money to the priestly class and the government class that offers to pretend to fix it or buy them a seat in heaven. It's absolute garbage. The existential journey is required for all of us. Who are we? What does this life mean? And the thing is, when you actually discover it means nothing, and you do actually discover it means nothing, and that's an incredibly depressing state, and we'll do depression and grief another day. But in that moment, when you get beyond that, and it's a hard one to get beyond, I'm not kidding, I do understand why existential therapy fell out of favour and why most people leave it till their deathbed. But when you do dare to journey in that way, when you do dare to heal yourself and plunge into the abyss, not looking for monsters, but seeking yourself. When you dare to do that and you discover that life doesn't actually mean anything at all and nothing actually matters, you're simply operating out of a programmed story that isn't even you, then guess what? Once you get past the blues of that, you can ascribe to your life any meaning you want. Do what you will. It's incredibly liberating. But you've got to do the journey to get there, okay? So anxiety is a crippling, horrible thing. Existential is where it all begins. And you're going to have to confront it, and don't leave it till your deathbed. Read philosophy. Stretch your mind. Stretch into what is it all about. Examine the questions of mortality, of meaninglessness, of aloneness, of freedom. Examine them. Tear your story asunder and discover what's underneath the gem, the diamond that you are. With your neurotic anxieties and the behaviours that flow from that, challenge them. Challenge them. There's so many good books out there. There are so many online courses that will help you cognitively challenge the story that you keep buying into. Practice mindfulness. Meditation is a very, very powerful tool. I'm not great at it, but I have discovered if I spend 10 minutes a day meditating, I feel better for the rest of the day. So I make myself do it every morning. It's good for the soul. It's good for the peace of mind. When it's reached behaviours that you're really struggling, where you can't leave the house, the agoraphobia, the fear of the marketplace, get some bloody help. And for those family who are enveloping and loving someone who's struggling in that way, particularly during the adolescent years, don't surrender to it. Stop reassuring them. Yes, I can see that you're afraid. It's a mindset. Breathe it up. Nothing terrible is happening. Just because you feel terrible doesn't mean anything terrible is happening. But each time you give into it, you build its strength. Each time you say no to that fear and go out of the door and go to the party, the fear subsides, habituated out of your system. And if you're struggling with that and you can't find the right thing online, God damn it, come and see me. We'll get to the source of it and flush it out of your field, okay? And when it comes to moral anxiety, have a look around at what runs the world. You really want to be bound to that? Really? Start challenging the rules. Start saying no, okay? So I hope this has given you a little bit of an idea about what anxiety is, where it comes from, our primal ancestors who shinnied up the tree first, why and how we perpetuate it generationally, and how we enforce it on the most brightest children in the universe by obliging them to listen to religious garbage from several thousand years ago, or ridiculous rules that have been handed down from times of catastrophe and what have you, and we don't even know why we do it. Rules become ritualized. We live 99% of our life out of a ritualized rule, and we've no idea that we're doing it or where it came from. Start examining your life. As the great saying goes, a life unexamined is a life not lived. Wake up, people. Read more. Challenge more. Challenge the people around you to stand up. And if you genuinely need help, there's lots of it out there. Online, people like me, there's lots of people like me, everywhere that can offer support and help to very quickly break down the emotional trauma that gave rise to it and set people free. So anxiety is a natural state of being, but you really must not let it rule your life, because when you do that, it gets bigger and stronger until in the end, you too could be like that woman in the corner of a kitchen with a can of kerosene and red fingers, terrified of the germs that are coming. Okay? Don't do it to yourself. You are all divine and precious gods and goddesses of the universe. You have no idea how powerful you are. There's a deliberate plot to keep you in this place. Time to say no, my friends. All right, that's it for today. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to bang on about tomorrow, but I'll let you know sometime during the day. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the feedback. And I'm really enjoying this process of sharing the videos, because I've been subsumed in the family of 3 small children over the last couple of years. And so while that's a joy and a delight, and I love it in so many ways, it has taken away from some of the work that I've been doing. And whilst that is coming to a natural and healthy end in the next 6 months, this has been this wonderful challenge that Simone, my beautiful daughter, and the wonderful folks at Social Media AOK, this challenge has actually reminded me, yeah, you do know a bit of shit, This is what you do. Share it. And it's been lovely to do this, because it's reminded me of another aspect of my being that I am now moving back towards. So Sunday night, peeps, back to the grind tomorrow, but don't let it be a grind. Don't let it be a grind. Don't let anxiety take you over. Just say, fuck that shit. It's my life. I'm going to learn about it a bit more. I'm going to peel back the story and get my own life. All right, darlings, love you all. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.